Hello, and welcome to That's Just Human. It's a podcast that explores all aspects of being human, living in a human body, and dealing with life's obstacles. Here we discuss all sorts of different stories from different people and share any practical tools or wisdom that comes through that. So today I'm really excited to introduce you to one of my friends that I met several years ago. She's currently a 52-year-old woman of Indian descent, and she's been highly challenged by a albeit beautifully blessed existence the past 18 years and has had a significant injury to her cerebellum, and the brain is playing a crucial role in coordinating the motor skills, fine motor movements, and maintaining the balance and regulating her muscle tone. So we're going to talk about that and how it's affected her life and how she's managed it with this incredible journey. And she's a true inspiration to me, and I hope that she is also a true inspiration to you as you get to hear about her story. So please welcome Shayla Roop.
Hi.
Hello. So good to chat with you today.
Yes. I'm happy to share my story.
Yes, I actually haven't gotten to hear the whole story, so I'm really excited. I
Okay.
remember meeting you at a party, and you said it's a long story, and you'd
It is.
tell me someday. And today is that
So
someday.
it started when I was 10 years old. And when I was 10, I had my appendix taken out. And I remember when I was recovering from that surgery, having the thought, this is not over. And then, of course, I'm a kid, and that thought went away. Forward 25 years later, in my mid 30s, I started having difficulty eating. Like I'd eat and it really hurt, and passing food was really hard. I went to see different, at the time I was working for Alpha Computer, so I had a good health insurance, and I went to see several GI specialists. Nobody could figure out what was going on. And by this time, I'd lost a lot of weight. So uh, Western medicine is, my experience has been, is that they can't figure out what's wrong with you, they'll just blame you. And then they started telling me I have an eating disorder. And I was like, no, I love to eat. I just can't eat. Like, nobody listened to me. So then I decided, I was already distrustful of Western medicine. And so I was living with my spiritual mentor, best friend at the time. And we were roommates. And he was like, I said, well, I think I'm just going to fast. Like, I knew about fasting, and I thought, it would help me, whatever was going on. Which in hindsight, that wasn't the right move when we realized what was wrong. So I ended up fasting I took sick leave from work and fasted for like almost a month on water. And then I didn't get better, and tried to eat. And then I started throwing up my food, and then got to the hospital. And they got me the first time I went to the hospital because I had gotten so weak. At this time, it was from malnutrition. We didn't know that because of what happened, ultimately what the reason was. So I got really weak, got taken to the ER. I spent 3 or 4 months in the hospital in ICU. I had two machines supporting me. One machine was feeding me. One machine was breathing for me. I was on a ventilator. So I was literally kept alive by two machines.
Wow.
And still the underlying problem hadn't been found. At this point, I was so thin. So just to give you an idea, my normal weight is about 120. I'm 5'5", so 120. And I was down to like 75.
Oh, that's tiny.
Yeah, I was like a skeleton. I can't even look at pictures of myself from
Oh
now.
my goodness.
So in the hospital, everyone assumed that I had an eating disorder. And it's so common that they just placed me in that. And it was like, it was frustrating because that wasn't the case at all. I love to eat. I've never not loved to eat, So I spent 4 months in the ICU. They kept me alive, but they still didn't find the problem. They released me. And then I tried to eat again, started throwing up, went back to the hospital. This time they did exploratory surgery, and they found that from the appendix removal when I was 10, the scar tissue, some people develop more scar tissue than others. Unfortunately, I did. And it started wrapping around my intestines for the next 25 years. So by the time I was in my mid-30s, I couldn't pass food. My intestines were pretty much shut.
Wow.
They got rid of the scar tissue. But by this time, because I had the first time in the ICU, I had stopped breathing. I have a chest tube scar. Malnutrition plus the lack of oxygen created the brain injury.
Oh my goodness.
And really, if somebody had figured it out from the beginning, I wouldn't have had this issue with brain injury. If somebody had said, "Oh yeah, this happens," but the problem with surgery, because a lot of surgeries they're not, they're new. They're, sometimes you don't know the side effect of a surgery until 20, 30 years later. A lot of doctors not being taught this, that side effect of appendicitis could be appendix removal as scar tissue can develop. Since then, I've heard of a few people this happening too. So because they couldn't figure it out, and because I decided to go a natural route, that in that specific case wouldn't have been, like, fasting was never going to get rid of the scar tissue. It was going to take surgery to open me up. So by this time, it was like July of 2007 or 2000, yeah. And I was able to finally eat again, start putting on weight. And I was at a regimen of eating, getting the weight back on, but the brain injury had already happened. And I started doing physical therapy, home therapy, occupational therapy. But I realized, like, I have tremors. I had really very little balance. That stayed. Like, that was the effect of all that happening. So yeah, it started when I was young, and I even had the premonition back then that this was going to turn into something. Obviously, I didn't know what, but so the last 18 years, the first 6 years, my mentor and we had met in Mexico. That's where he like took me under his tutorship and opened me up spiritually. So we went back there because he's like, we can get help for you on your disability salary, the full-time care you need, much more affordable. So I spent the first 6 years of this disability in Mexico. And we set up a home gym. We just basically set up a healing center in the home. And we could afford this beautiful home for a fraction of the rent here in the US. So that was really nice. Like, I got to spend, 6 years there. And it was a really potent time because it was very peaceful where we were. It was good for my mental health. That the food was good. I had a girl working for me full time. She was great. She helped me with everything. So it was a really good period of healing and getting myself to where I could be a little more independent. I used a walker the initial 6, 7 years. Even in the home, I couldn't walk around without a walker because my balance was so bad.
Wow.
And so I celebrated my 40th birthday in Mexico, and I have pictures that I had a walker then. And then because I've lived a lot around different places in my life, I kind of get a sense when it's time to move. And after 6 years in Mexico, I felt like it was time to move on for the next step of my journey for healing. And then I came to Dallas, which is where I met you.
Yeah.
Stay with my sister. And, I've done, so I'm trying to figure out where to veer off from here. There's different levels to the healing I'm going for, but ultimately what became very clear to me is that the work that I'm doing this lifetime, the physical healing is just part of it, but that my spirit really wanted to make some great progress on the spiritual level. Like, this field is all very, very spiritual. Like, obviously it's all connected to your spiritual, to your physical. The fact that it started so young means that maybe I brought something in from a past life that I'm trying to resolve this lifetime. And one of the things that this has given me, the biggest blessing that I've gotten from this, is not having to work. I earned disability, both government disability as well as private, because I used to work for Apple and tech companies, as we know. Good thing they take care of their employees. So I make a decent income, based on the disability. And the neurologists have all signed off. I'm like, yes, you can't work. And so that's given me freedom in other ways. That I don't have the freedom of movement. I can't leave my house alone. I have to have someone with me. But on the other hand, I don't have to work, and I've been able to spend the last 18 years really dedicating myself to spiritual growth. And studying, just really throwing myself into that part of my life in a way that often people can't when you've got to work and you've got all this, and it's hard to get to your spiritual studies or whatever, so that's been a huge part. So that's kind of summing it up, and here I am today, exact same symptoms and nothing has changed. I've done physical therapy. I went to India 2 years ago, spent 6 months there doing physical therapy. And so I can work through my symptoms. Like, I'm better getting balanced. Everything I have right now, the improvements I made, I've done I've done it. Like, the symptoms, they've gotten better. I'm very persistent. So I've really, I can walk around. My gait's off. You can tell when I walk, but now I can at least walk around,
You can, now I remember when I met you, you kind of had described moving around was similar to what other people experience when they're drunk.
Yeah, so when you drink, your cerebellum is what's affected. That's why people weave, and it's the part of your body, the brain, that controls your movement is what alcohol affects. So because mine's damaged, it's very similar. Like, if you see me walking and you didn't know any better, it's happened to me in Mexico, like a couple of times. They would say, borracha, like a drunk girl. And I would laugh, because at that point, humor was all I had. I couldn't explain to someone. But yeah, it's very similar. So if anyone wants to know what it feels like for me 24/7, it's the same as being completely drunk, but as far as motor skills go,
So would you say that now, because you say your balance is a little bit better, are you able to experience a little less of that? Or is it still pretty similar?
So it balances better through physical therapy. It's not better. The symptoms are still bad. Like, I've had a couple of falls. So I was living in Dallas, and I gave up everything 2.5 years ago. I decided to just be a nomad full time, to really pursue healing and use my income instead of paying for rent, paying for staying places, physical therapy, wherever, spending that income on my healing. And since I left the comfort and safety of a home, I've had a few falls. Nothing too bad, but they have happened. And I thought, but that's part of going out in the world. And I have to be very careful. I can't turn around very quickly. I'll fall. I have to really be mindful when I make any sudden moves, really slow, because I will lose my balance. I've already had like 3 or 4 falls.
Do you
Couple of bruises.
do you typically have somebody with you to help catch you if you fall, or?
Well, the first time I fell, I was in Costa Rica at a retreat, and it was right outside my room. Nobody was with me. No, I went outside my room, and then something happened. I lost my balance and fell right from my room and bruised.
Oh,
So it's like that. Like, I can't have someone next to me 24/7,
right.
And so it's usually, and then I was in Greece that same summer. No, and then there's these stairs in a restaurant right in front. Like, there's the cashier, and then there's some steps. And I was about to go down the steps, and I usually have to hold something to go downstairs. So I've been staying there with me. My friend and I were there for a week, so I knew how to get. I kind of figure out how to move around, like where I could put my hand. Well, this woman was trying to help me, and she called my name because there was another door exit, and she thought, oh, that'd be easier for her to get out, not realizing that when I'm moving, don't call for my attention, because if I take my attention off the movement, I will fall. And it just so happened, and I'm learning too, if somebody calls my name, just don't even answer. Stop, be very stable, then turn around, then say, okay, what? Don't. Well, in that moment, she caught me off guard, and I turned around, and then the stairs were right there, and I fell. I took a spill, and that one was bad. My knee was swollen. My friend that I traveled with, he ended up having to piggyback me.
Oh my goodness.
So this isn't over, and this just happened in 2023,
Yeah.
3 months ago, I was in front of my sister's house. I've been staying with her, I've been staying with mama and my mom, and I turned around, there's something too fast, and I fell again, and I threw my phone because it was in my hand. So now the pixels are out my phone. Things like, it's not a big deal, but yeah, it impacts my life. I just had a fall 3 months ago.
Oh.
And
So have you had breaks or sprains?
no, thank goodness. No, just swelling, bruising. but no breaks, thank God. Like that's, and I'm usually really careful. So all the things that we all need to work on, like mindfulness, I have to do extra, especially when moving. I have to really be careful about what steps to take, where I'm at. Indoors, I can be on my own. Out in the world, I can't be alone. I have to have someone with me. I can't be out on the road. I just can't be out in the world alone.
So are you able to drive or not drive with this?
No, I can't drive. My motor skills are like a drunk person. So I
Wow.
be able to respond. Yeah, it's not safe at all.
So I view you as a pretty healthy person from everything that I know about you, and I know at least diet wise. So do you try to, aside from physical therapy, incorporate other forms of movement in your life?
Yeah, well, so one of the things that's the hardest for me to not be able to do is dance. Used to love to dance, and I've learned Indian culture is big on dance too. I learned a lot of that growing up, and so when I'm by myself, I'll dance because I have a space for myself. I find that other people around me can throw my balance off. Everyone has energy around them, and it's like it's better for by myself. I can really move and let loose, and I'm near things in case I lose my balance. I can hold. Right now, I'm staying with my mother, and we go to the gym. We go to the YMCA gym every morning. I love working out, and machines are helpful because they give you balance. I can do the
Oh,
treadmill, I can do elliptical because I hold on, like I can get my body to work out. Otherwise, it's really hard for me to get like physical workout without some gym machines are really helpful. Or if I go hiking, it's with a friend, and I just need to hold. What has gotten better, friends have noticed, they've known me for years, that before I used to grip really tightly onto a friend when walking, and now I'm barely, they're like, well, you barely hold me. I'm like, yeah, I've gotten better at finding my balance, creating my balance, basically.
that's
So,
fantastic.
but yeah, I do keep up because, I mean, all the things that all humans need to be healthy, I have to make sure I do because I'm already at a deficit as far as my brain function. And so if I don't do all the things, then I'm really behind. Does that make sense? So it's really,
Yeah,
diet is even more important because of that. So when you're already a step below, you've got to make sure just to keep up. So yeah, I've maintained that. I eat a high raw vegan diet, so 90% of my foods is raw foods, fruits and vegetables. And then I've kept that for many years. Um, there's this is my sister's dog. Say hello. And
hello, pups.
so I would say that that's really help. All the physical work I've been has been helping me. The other thing I want to talk about is the mental health aspect of all this, which is
Yes.
it's not easy to go from, I mean, I used to live in Austin. This happened to me in Austin, Texas. And as we all know, Austin, Texas is full of hiking trails. And I used to go by myself, mountain biking, hiking. I did all these things. And all of a sudden, boom, I can't do any of it. And it's not easy to be around people who can move freely and you can't. It feels like I'm imprisoned by my own body. So there's been really difficult moments of basically wanting to take my own life. I've been through that a few times. The closest I ever got, the only thing that stopped me was the pain that it would cause my mother. Like that,
Wow.
because we immigrated from India, and my mom, I was born, and then she brought me over as a baby, and she worked hard to get me here. Like I thought about all that she did to give me a life here in this country, and like that really, I have to say, the love of mothers that stopped me. The one time I got really close. Since then, it's been a spiritual journey to like acceptance has been hard because if I'm considering suicide, I'm not accepting what's happened to me. And so that's been the biggest sort of spiritual principle I've had to really integrate is acceptance, really fully accepting what's happening to me. Not that it's unfair, whatever, but it's what's happening.
I can imagine that's really, really hard. I mean, I'm very blessed to have a body that moves. And so, um, and I've experienced bouts of depression at different points, usually triggered by different events that are happening.
Right.
So I can only imagine having to live 24/7 where you're wanting to do other things and being pissed off at your own body.
Yeah, it has been a lot of that. I would say in the last year, I've really come to terms with there was an incident that happened a year ago, and it really brought me to um, gratitude for the blessings I do have, acceptance that this, and not only just acceptance, I really believe that whatever you're experiencing, your spirit chose it. Your ego may not accept that, your physical human ego. But your spirit has its own agenda in this physical world. Like it really has to do with divinity and experiencing divinity in the physical form. And so I have to really come like accept my own, that I chose this. This is, I mean, the fact that it started so young, clearly it was written out. And so that has really helped in the last year. I've really accepted it. I do a lot of psychedelic journeys to help me, my mental health. And last year I went to Colorado, rented out this beautiful space up in the mountains with friends. And that particular journey was beautiful because I started channeling like messages. And one of the messages I got is love your life, love it. The harder it gets, love it more.
Oh, that's beautiful.
I know, and that really helped me because now when I'm like, what was that message you got? And it was back in October, I did the psychedelic ceremony, and that message came to me. Harder it gets, love it more. And that's what I've been practicing. So you're catching me where it's like every 6 months I make some kind of breakthrough again, because when you're going through this, you have to be at a point where you're at peace, basically. I want to be at peace, and I want to stop threatening my body with murder, basically.
Yeah. So aside from psychedelics, what other, I guess, spiritual practices or things have come across that have been very helpful for you?
So in India, we do a lot of Sanskrit chanting mantras. I'm sure you'd like Om Shanti. There's so many.
Yeah.
I have really thrown myself into these chants because I have time. I'll find one I like. I'll find the words written out, and then I'll spend hours chanting and practicing. And I'm gotten really good at it. And the other day, and I was with, I'm staying with my mom right now, and I had something playing, and I started singing along, and my mom goes, "Wow, you know those words?" She was like, the fact that my mom was impressed, and I didn't think about it. It's something I've been doing the last 18 years. I've really thrown myself into. So chanting Sanskrit mantras has really, and I don't know if you know the science behind it, but like every sound has a certain vibration, and ancient yogis figured out certain sounds put together create certain vibrations, certain energies. And so I've really like gotten into that. It's to the point where I want to travel or hold retreats, psychedelic retreats, where we actually, one of the last psychedelic retreat we did in November, me and my friend and her partner, we did 5 minutes of chanting Sanskrit mantra while on psychedelics. And it was like, they were like, wow, it's amazing. So it's, psychedelics open up certain parts of your brain that you can get to without the medicine, but it's like a key. It opens it up faster, and then when you combine it with like yogic principles and mantras, and so I did that. So I'm starting to build my own sort of, I don't want to use the word career, but I guess my life's work as a healer as well as a spiritual psychedelic priestess, kind of what I call myself. And that came from this too.
That's beautiful.
So yeah, and using my roots from India and using that as part of the healing. So I'm healing myself, and like, I'm not giving up. I'm just not like, there's I walk a fine line. On the one hand, I have to accept that I may be like this the rest of my life, and I got to be okay with that, really okay with it. But at the same time, I'm not giving up, because I really believe in our body's ability to heal. We all know the power of the mind. I've learned all about that. I've been to many Joe Dispenza retreats. I've really just dug deep in spiritual wisdom education and learning and all that. And so now I was practicing it, doing meditation, doing the visualization, doing the chanting, and I have time to do all that. So I'm blessed. I'm getting to do that.
That's awesome. I'm so glad to get to see you, coming into life's purpose. And I find it really interesting just from watching people, especially women, like getting into their 50s, really discovering like I went through all of these trials and errors and challenges in my life, and then now I'm figuring out what it is I'm supposed to do. So maybe like the first part of our lives is having all these experiences, and then later on we actually put that together and can utilize those experiences to help other people in a really beautiful way.
Absolutely. And there's so many things that there's more clarity that's coming to me through my journey too. Like, we heal ourselves, we heal others, we heal others, we heal ourselves. It's all connected. And the
Yeah.
oneness, the experience of oneness with everyone. And like, and I do appreciate when people tell me it's an inspiration what I'm doing, because to me it feels so hard, but it's nice to get someone else's perspective on what I'm doing. I can't see myself in that way. And so I appreciate hearing. I have a really close group of friends that I trust. I call them my true crew.
I love that.
I have people that are true, and these are people that have helped me travel. I'm really fortunate in that I've traveled a lot since this happened, mainly because I'm able to find friends. Like, I want to go to Greece. I didn't know how it was going to happen. I was in Europe in 2023. I was in Spain. I had gone with they had a Sanskrit mantra festival in Spain. And months before, I was like, I want to be there, and it worked out. I got to go. I met this woman, her daughter is in Spain. She's like, my daughter can help accompany you. I said, I'll get her a ticket. So just whenever I want to go somewhere, some angel just shows up to help. Because I can't go to any festival by myself, So this
Yeah.
woman, I met the mother, her daughter was in her 20s, and she's like, yeah, I'll help you. And so we went to this festival, and it was like 3 days of different singers like Deborah Preval, if you've heard of her. There are a lot of Western singers that have gone to India and studied the songs. And this was in Spain in the mountains, and there was 3 days of Sanskrit chanting and mantra. Oh my God, it was amazing. And then I went to Barcelona and spent a couple of days there. I didn't know, and then I met some people at the festival, and I told this one guy, I was like, hey, if you got a day, can you show me around Barcelona? He's like, sure. This is what I do. I'm very outgoing. I'm very extroverted, so I can easily connect with people. And then I was talking to him. I was like, yeah, I really want to go to Greece. I just don't know. I can't go by myself. He's like, oh, where I'm staying, there's a guy from Colombia. He wants to go to Greece. Let me introduce you to him. We met him. We got tickets that day to Greece and went to Greece together.
That is so amazing.
He's the one who took me piggyback when I fell, Like, he was so respectful, such a good. So I've been very, very fortunate. I attract really good people, especially men. I've attracted some really reliable, solid, like this guy. I barely knew him, and other people might look at it and go, God, you just went traveling with the guy you don't know. But I feel like I can sense it's a good guy. And these guys that I've met usually they take care of me, because I need physical help out in the world. It's not just like. And so that's another blessing. I've had a really good divine male energy helping me in my life when I
It
need.
sounds like your life is very divinely guided. Like there's, like you said, little angels that come in, but
Yeah.
on the other side, you have got some guides totally watching out for you.
So can I share with you my latest thing that's happening?
Yes, please.
So in between travels, I come stay with my mom or sister there in Texas. And I am going to Peru in June. And that was not on my radar at all. And one of the things I asked, intention I made for myself a couple of years ago, was start living by intuitive guidance more than intellectual thought, which is fine. I'm a good thinker. I'm a good planner. I'm not putting that down. But I weigh too heavily on that. And I wanted to be more like guide me. I want to be like guided towards something. And this Peru trip happened like pure, like it wasn't even on my radar. I had no, like it wasn't even like I want to go to Peru. I'm not gonna say no to it. So yeah, it's happened. My tickets have been bought. It's a 2 week retreat. My best friend's coming with me because I can't do it alone. Um, and I feel like since I left my home a couple of years ago and got living like a nomad and saving up money, it's all been for this trip. So let's see what happens. Because I'm not giving up. And of course there'll be, ceremonies, plant medicine ceremonies there, and in the jungle, and the origin of that medicine, So, and
Yes.
I mean, I'm just like, okay, I mean, guided. I'm definitely being guided to this next. So right now I've spent 3 months at my mom's, grounding down, taking care of myself, just relaxing. Got 1 more month in Texas with my sister, and then I'm off traveling, and then Peru in June, and then we'll see from there. But yeah.
So how is that? I mean, I love traveling personally, but it's always been for me more little tiny road trips, maybe a week max or something. So, how is that to spend several months, I guess, in certain areas or having that ability? Is it, are you able to regulate your like daily routines, or do you have kind of a small chaos and then you have to get back to yourself? How does that work for you?
So I do like I don't like the kind of travel where you hit spots and move on to next. I mean, some people are good like that, hopping, city hopping or whatever. I like to spend time somewhere because I like to absorb the culture, get to know the people, what's around. And actually, when you spend time somewhere, things come to you. You got to be still for a bit. So, and then, of course, the physical rest too. Like my friend and I, that has gone to Peru with me, we had gone to Mexico a couple of years ago, and we spent a week in this place. And there's like, we had plans to go somewhere, but every day she checks in with me. Oh, your energy's not good. We don't have to go. Like there were times that we made plans that didn't go because if my energy wasn't up, because one of the issues is energy blocks that I face, because cerebellum also manages your energy of your body. And so there are days, and I think it happened with us, where I have zero energy. I could barely feed myself. Like I barely get up and do anything. And so if that happens while we're traveling, because we've set up to be there for a while, we don't feel like we're missing anything. So yes, that's a good question. It does allow, being somewhere for a while has many benefits in terms of like being able to rest, being able to really explore, being able to get to know people. I really prefer, and I prefer going, I mean, I go for a month or two. I did that one summer in Mexico. I met one guy. I was like, can you help me? I'm going to show up. I get one person to agree to at least help me, and then I just show up. And even later, I'm like, am I crazy? Like, I'm really adventurous to the point where even I'm like, what did I just do?
That is so cool. Um, so earlier you mentioned like on the dance floor, you other people's energies affect you. Have before this happened and you went on, even on your spiritual journey and stuff, would you say that you were even cognizant and aware of other people's energy, or has that been something that you've developed as part of this journey?
I was aware of it, but I think I was a lot self-centered, I guess. I mean, we all can be, but I was pretty heavily self-centered. And when this happened to me initially, like even speaking was difficult. When I'm really tired, I'll start to slur a little bit because it's still the same motor skills to move your jaw and everything. So for the first few years, I just had to sit down and shut up, basically. That's what the universe made me do. I couldn't move around. I couldn't talk very easily. So I started to really watch and observe and learned so much about reading people and hearing people and things that I wasn't doing before this. Like this, so great question. Exactly. I got much better at really feeling where people are at and what they're doing and learning more, because you don't learn by talking about yourself. You don't learn anything when you're talking. It's when you're quiet and silent that you really absorb what's going on. So really helped me with that.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'm also really interested, like as you develop, coming into your own soul purpose and wanting to do psychedelic retreats, do you have any kind of a vision, as in maybe places that you want to do that, or I don't know, one place, several places?
Yeah, yeah, the tropics for sure. I'm going to move to the tropics actually. That's I put myself in Jordan Jowls and I said this is the last time I live in like when I move it'll be probably out of the country. I'm going to look at the tropics of Mexico because I've lived there before. I lived there 6 years, so I had a permanent resident card already. And I'm going to go to the Yucatan, but it's going to be tropical. I would infuse my sort of dietary magic, the fruit. Like, I've had people who eat with me for a week, like, because I eat a heavy fruit diet. I'm not talking like a piece of fruit. I'm like talking like 4 or 5 bananas a day, 3 or 4 oranges, like heavy amounts of fruit. And I've had people join me and they're like, oh my God, I feel amazing. This is amazing. So I'd love to infuse sort of the nutrition that I practice on
Yes.
with like the ceremonies and then yoga, chanting, all the things that I've collected over these years, put them in a retreat form. And yeah, all of it, and the medicine is just one part of it, you know.
I want to go to one of these retreats. It sounds
Absolutely,
awesome.
totally get it. And I went to, I've learned things from others. I have a friend in North Carolina that does Aya retreats, and she was really good about the second day after you did medicine. We all sit in a circle of integration together, and that's the first time I'd experienced that, with the Aya ceremony. And I was like, "Oh, this is so important," because we all took turns talking about what we experienced, and then somebody else would then you'd open the floor and somebody say, would you like to hear what I have to say? And you could say yes, no. Everyone said yes, and then they would talk about what their perception of what you went through, which helps you unlock more. Like, it was really powerful. So I've learned a lot by doing other people's ceremonies. And the other thing I've learned a lot is massage, especially Thai massage. I haven't gotten a lot of Thai massage. In fact, my first boyfriend after my brain injury was a yoga instructor / Thai massage. And my friends were like, how did you? I'm like, I was taken care of. Like, the first guy who I had a serious relationship was part of my healing. We did yoga every day. So
That's so
as
cool.
I tell you this, even I'm like, okay, whenever I feel down, look how well I've been taken care of. So I would love to officially, I'd love to go to Thailand and get training in Thai massage because that's a really beautiful. You're on the floor. Have you ever received Thai massage?
I trained in Vedic Thai yoga, which is a form of Thai massage.
Yeah,
But there's so many stretches that I only memorized a couple of them, and
yeah,
I don't actually practice it. But it was a really cool class to take, and I've never actually gotten to experience myself receiving
oh,
whole
okay,
session of Thai massage. The only what I've received, because you just do everything in chunks. It's like you're
yeah,
studying this one particular stretch, so you learn it, and then you take turns with your whoever
that,
you're working with and try doing out the technique, and then you go on to the next one. So by the time you've done this for 2 days, you've gotten a full body massage, but it happened in just these little spurts.
right. So I've gotten a lot of Thai massage. I've got a lot of massage in general. I'm pretty good at it just intuitively. Even one time I gave my massage therapist in Mexico a massage. She's like, wow, you're really good. I'm like, when you receive something for so long, because I've needed it, I've actually become intuitively good at it. And my mom, she's 75, getting older, and just the other night I did like a stretch massage on her, and she was like, "Where'd you learn this? YouTube?" I said, "No, Mom, from receiving it. Like, I've just picked up things, and like I would stretch. So I want to expand my skill set in healing, and one of them is like time. And I love time massage because you don't need table, you don't need oil, you just need a floor mat, and you stretch and pull, you understand
Yeah.
the concept. And I love that because then you can do it anywhere in the world. You don't need anything. You just need your abilities to do that. So that's something I really want to, one of my things up ahead is go to Thailand and get officially like education on it.
I mean, I definitely would agree, as a massage therapist, but I do like skin to skin contact,
So which is,
normal
yeah, I love
what you
that.
think about as massage. But I feel I've gotten better by receiving massage. Like, I will get on anybody's table. I don't care if you're good or bad at it. because that's given me a better internal perception as to what a technique might feel like. And
Yeah,
then it's shifted the way that I work because I know, like, if someone does something and it hurts, I know that that might hurt somebody else. If
that's
they
right. You
do,
gotta receive it. Yeah.
yeah, if they do something and I'm like, oh, wow, that was amazing, I'm
Yeah.
going to have to steal that particular move. So it's tweaked. I've been doing it for 15 or 16 years. Oh, man.
Wow.
I don't
You
even
do
know
deep
how,
tissue,
huh?
deep, deep tissue like Swedish massage.
You start with Swedish, and I learned deep tissue, and now you have to continue taking education every couple years to keep your
Yeah.
license up. And I always study something completely different, completely new. I
Nice.
tend, I really thought I was going to be like this technical person, talking about your muscles. We can do this, we can fix this, but I've actually gravitated to everything I do is energetic, or even if it's teaching you something technical, there's always some energetic level
Yep.
to it. And so I actually am just now kind of accepting, oh, I'm kind of a semi woo woo massage
Intuitive.
therapist,
I mean, it sounds like
but
you're intuitive.
it is. I'm very intuitive, and if people aren't, it's hard to explain to people who haven't delved into spirituality or don't understand when you
Right.
say I'm intuitive, and I try to explain like when I just touch you, I just know like it's not a conscious knowing, and I just will move, my hands will move, and you will feel. You'll be like, how did you immediately go to this
Yeah.
place that was
Yeah.
hurting? And I'm like, I don't know. I just did.
You just did. Yeah.
Yeah,
No.
there's no rhyme or reason. That's what the intuitiveness is. And then learning energetics from several different forms of types of energy work has really allowed me to go deeper. And like you say with the chants, that's been your number one healing thing. I would say for me, breath work
Yeah.
has
Breathwork
been.
is another good one. I'm not consistent, but I love it. When I do, love it. Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't been consistent, but I definitely love and do breath work. But when I'm working, I find even before I knew about energetics, because I did not believe in energy whenever I first became a massage therapist, and teachers were telling us about energetic transfer, this and that, and I'm thinking, man, y'all are full of some BS over here. Boy, was I wrong. And
And
um,
everything's energy, actually, everything.
it is.
Even physical objects, they're just slow moving energy. It's all, yeah. Once you delve into that, you realize that. But so there's one more skill, there's multiple skills that have developed over the course of these 18 years. One, like I said, is I love the healing arts, the massage, the working with psychedelics for healing. Another is astrology. I was already interested in it. I was already into it before my brain injury, but once it happened, I had all this time, so I really delved into it. Now I give professional readings. And I often do, my favorite is to trade for a massage. I feel like, massage therapist. Um, and then the other is preparing food. I want to open a natural foods restaurant. Um,
Ooh.
I want to go somewhere where you go and you eat and you feel good after you eat. Not heavy, not, like you feel like what, because people, when I feed them now, they feel, I already do that on a personal level. I'll make really healthy, yummy food, and people always are like, God, it tastes good and I feel amazing. And I'm like, that's what I want. So that's my vision for the future. I want this beautiful natural fruits cafe, good energy, good food. I'm like, oh, and then my chocolatier as well. I don't know if you remember that. I don't know if you ever
I
had.
do. I've seen pictures that you post, and every time I am drooling, they look so good.
Yeah, and I have an IG page on my chocolates too, so I'll send that to you. It's just
Oh,
chocolates. I just thought I'd start documenting everything I'm making, and so that's another area. All these things I was interested in before the brain injury, but after having all this time and ability to do with what I want with my time, basically, I've developed these skills. So. Um, that's why part of me is like, I don't feel like I'm meant to be in this condition the rest of my life. Like I have so many things I could do, and I really want to be a productive, uplifting member of the human race. Like I want to go out there and do work. I want to help people. It's not just for me. I mean, I'd love to be able to run and dance, but I tell myself you can do a lot of good where you're at. it doesn't have to be that I have to be at, but I'm just like, but I want to. I would love to be able to donate my time and energy to do things. And I heard something recently, like you're a uplifting something, a productive uplifter or something like that. Like that's where I want to be. I want to produce. I want to contribute to a community, and I want to uplift in any way that I can.
Yeah, I think it's showing up, and this is kind of what I've heard before. I remember somebody talking about they were running some sister circles, and that there were times that they just felt like they were a hot mess, whatever else is happening in life, and you get there and you chose to lead this. And I think we tend to assume that we should be perfectly in this place, that when other people are looking at us, but I think it's when we show up authentically, and even when we're a hot mess,
That's
it,
right.
it lets people know that, oh, you're like me, you're not like this perfect person that I could never attain to be.
Right.
And that's even part of this podcast, is that I want people to just set in with, like, we are all literally just human,
Yeah.
and there's ups and downs of that, and there's we all have some really amazing positive aspects, we all have some shadow aspects, and that's really just a part of experiencing humanness, and part of going through life in these bodies and the experiences that we have. And maybe by sharing different stories, other people can feel a little bit more comfortable in their own skin, a little bit more willing to just be authentic to who they are, regardless of what that is. And maybe even start accepting other people where they are, even though we don't understand.
Yeah, I think that's big, accepting yourself and accepting others. And I'm really like, that's key, and being okay. Now, if somebody does something that you need to talk to them, like, hey, that didn't feel good to me, or that hurt, or whatever, that's different. You can work out your dynamics with people in your lives. That nobody's saying be a doormat, um, but don't put on people what you think they should do.
Right.
And really, that's something that we're all always learning. Stop putting on others your standards. You uphold your standards, and talk to people if you need to, as far as if something's happening. Because I've had friends talk to me about something I've done, and now I honestly was like, oh my God, I did not even realize. Thank you for saying something. Because sometimes you don't realize that you might have done something to hurt or disregard, or we do. We're not like. So I think that's something I've learned too, is communication, and listening. I've gotten better at it, and I'm still working on it. Like listening and start immediately thinking, oh, it should be this way, it should be that way. Just listen to where somebody's really at, and that's something that I'm practicing every day.
That's a real skill to learn
It
to
is.
develop, but also something that's needed. That is being a productive member of society. Just
Yeah,
listen to somebody.
exactly. No, exactly. And really empathy is big, all these things. So yeah, it's I'm grateful. And gratitude, I always call it the lifeline. Like if you're really feeling your worst, there is everybody has something they be grateful for. You could be in a prison cell and still find something to be grateful for. So I've been practicing that as much as I can. Another practice that has come up, have you heard of Ho'oponopono?
I've heard of it, yeah.
So I've heard it over the years, and I knew what it was. It's the I'm sorry, please forgive me, I love you, thank you, or thank you, I love you. And it came back up again because I had some conflicts within the family. And then all of a sudden this came up, and I was like, and so I've started, like, I'll put on some music and then I'll just start chanting it. And part of it is to myself too, apologizing for all the times that I wanted to take my own life, or apologizing for, yeah, I don't know. It's very healing on many levels, apologizing. And also if you feel like somebody's done you wrong, you just chant it. You just forgive, you just let things go, like you clear it. So it's another practice I've been doing recently, and it's
I
good.
need to practice that.
It's a good one, and it's so easy. It's sometimes at night, like if I'm getting frustrated, I'll just say, "Okay, I'm sorry. Please forgive me. Thank you. I love you." You know, it's really beautiful. And the more you say it, it feels good too. Try it. Try it. Like I get into it. I just play some music that I like without words, and then I just start, and I'm like, "Oh my God, I feel amazing." It feels really good, you know, because the power of language cannot be underestimated. The words, the way we put them together, and when you start chanting certain things like Sanskrit mantras too, a lot of times people say, "Do you know what that means?" I'm like, I haven't studied that in depth on every word. Some things I know, but you don't have to know. Just by pronouncing them and saying them and feeling the energy, you get the benefit. You don't have to necessarily know what they mean. But if you do, even better. And so like that's an example of practicing things. I have sound bowls, a couple of sound bowls that that we're lucky in this day and age that normal people can get their hands on all these cool tools. And even 50 years ago, it would have been hard to get your hands on a sound bowl. So I've been doing toning with my voice, because apparently when you hum, it's really healing for all your cells, like things like that are easy to do. I'm trying to like get better at doing it, and pray that, and not give up the part of me. I remember I used to go trail running. That was my favorite. I don't like to run on roads. That's boring. But like in Austin, there were all kinds of trails, and you'd like have to jump over stuff, and that. So I use that memory to visualize my body to activate those neural pathways. And then I want to be better at doing that, or dancing. I'll play some music and I'll just imagine myself moving around free. And so yeah, I've had many people say that they pray for me, they can see me healed, and I would love to come back on your show and be like, "It's done."
That would be so cool. I really find it neat that because you can't use your body as much, that you have gravitated to still using your body, but using the voice, and that has been your outlet
Yeah, it has,
for
right.
really getting in touch with yourself, because it's still a part of your body. It's just using it in a different way, and that's been your medicine.
It has. You're absolutely right. It has. I've started recording myself singing some mantras, chanting some. Like, I want to start getting my voice. I want to take some voice. Another thing I'm calling in, like voice yoga or voice toning, so that I can sing these mantras. And it's just breath work. Really, it's learning how to push your breath up so that you're not just. Most good singers don't just use vocal cords. You'll burn your vocal cords out. It's about using your air to really get the sound out, your lungs. And so I'm working on some of that, like, there's like voice yoga and things like that. So thank you again. That's very on point. That's a way I'm expressing that energy inside of me, because I can't run around and dance or run. I can, singing can do that too.
Yes. And then because you can share that with other people, then there's
Yeah.
going to be somebody who resonates with, oh, that's like what it is for me. And, because I've noticed in my own life, I was very dissociated when I was younger. And so a lot of my journey has been learning how to be present in my own body, and then like just to actually feel into my body. So, I
Yeah.
wasn't allowed to dance growing up. And so dance came to me into my 30s, and I experienced ecstatic dance, which for me has been one of the most freeing, amazing, therapeutic things that I could ever experience. If I am having any emotional turmoil, if I throw some music on and I just like am able to dance, then I can move that energy out of me, and that's been the most effective. But I think we find things based on our experiences or how we process within ourselves. And so there's not one specific thing. I love that there's so many different things.
Yeah, and there are some commonalities. All cultures have their dances, all cultures have their songs. Like that's part of the human experience. I mean, kids, 2 3 years old, they start singing and dancing. They love it. Like that's a universal human thing. And then it's sad that you weren't able to access it till you get older for whatever, all humans aren't doing everything right now. There are a lot of weird things going on, but I'm glad that you're able to. And I did start going to the Dallas right before COVID. After COVID, it kind of broke up, and now I haven't gone in a while. And initially, I had a lot of, once people realized, because I couldn't dance on my own, I'd dance against the wall, and then somebody would get my hand and dance with me, and then that was really starting to help.
That's so
So
beautiful.
yeah, it was really beautiful. Like the Dallas community has been really, really good, supportive, really kind, really helpful. If I wanted to go somewhere or do anything, I always had people help me out, and it's been very special. Like, I've appreciated my time here, and I'm not going to say, but I'm looking for my spot to settle down, to live for the rest of my life. Like, I've moved around. I've been a nomad pretty much my whole life. My parents moved. I mean, I took my first transatlantic flight at 6 months old. So it just started when I was a baby, and it hasn't stopped. But I am ready to find like my forever home, to have a home. This is it. I'm not going to move until I leave the planet, leave this body. So I am calling that in, and some not permanent stability, some stability in my life, including my body, the stability.
Yeah.
So maybe it'll all come into focus.
I wonder if those will end up coinciding together. Like you start to get stability of your home, and then that also translates into your body as
Yeah,
well.
no, I love that. I like that. It's the home. I want a partner. I've been single for 5 years now, which is probably the longest I've been single. Almost 6 years. It'll be 6 in August. As an adult, I've never gone this long. But I also, like, sometimes I get frustrated. Part of me is like, this means something, because I'm no longer willing to settle, I guess that's the best way to put it. Like, I know what I'm calling in as a partner. I know who I am. I know what I have to offer. So maybe this is why it's taken so many years, like, here I am. But it's the same thing. I want stability in a relationship, stability with a community, stability in a home, stability in my body. And you're right, it could all like click together within the same time period. Yeah.
Yeah. I can see that happening for you as you go along. And just from your description of men that you've been able to attract already in your life, then whoever this partner is probably is doing his own healing work and
That's
will
right.
already, like you're already attracting amazing men. And so this guy is going to be like even steps above that and exactly what it is that you need to be there for you in that aspect.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, no, I've had a lot of friends tell me that too. So it's a reminder to be patient with the universe, be patient with myself. Patience is hard always, I want it all right now, but um it's whatever the divine timing is, we have to trust that
Yes.
whatever timing it is, it's fine. It's, when things happen, you go, oh, no wonder, it's happening now instead of a year ago. So,
Yeah. Is there anything else that you wanted to share about your journey before we kind of wrap things into a close?
um, I would say that one of the things that I have really gotten to see is the light in people. Because I need so much help, it brings out the light in them to help me. People actually get happy and excited to help me. I didn't quite expect that. And I realized that part of my being in this condition, part of the purpose of serving, is allowing other people the chance to be of service.
Mm.
And it took some time for me to see that. Like, okay, sometimes the best in people come out during natural disasters, or something really has to go wrong for people to rise up. And my condition often does that for people. Like, they'll rise up and they'll just be like falling over themselves to help me. And I'm just like, oh my God, great. So it helps me accept where I'm at, because my presence gives other people a chance to turn their light on and be of service. Because I really believe we humans are here to love and to be of service, whether it's to
Yeah.
others, to the land. We're here to be of service. That just so resonates now. So that's what I want to say, is that I'm so fortunate that my misfortune has brought out other people's light.
That's amazing. So, last question, I ask everybody this. Um, is there any bit of wisdom that you would like to leave anyone listening with?
Oh, you have to be your own hero ultimately. You've Other people, I have lots of support. People can support you, but the only person that can love you that way is you. And the only person that can really be there for you is you. And I've spent many, many days alone because I can't easily go out. So I've had to really sit with myself. And that truth is really there, that nobody else can love you the way you can love yourself. And it's not just like, oh, I love myself. It's like you really love yourself, and really, so that when you're loving yourself, you have love to spread. Does that make sense? So that's
Yeah.
is to really be there for you, be there for yourself in a way that nobody else can be.
I love that. That's fantastic. I want to thank you so much for coming and sharing your story, not just with me, but whoever is able to come across this and hear this beautiful story, the beautiful words that you've shared, and maybe touch their soul and wherever they are.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for giving me a chance to share my story. I'm very honored. Thank you.
You're welcome. So, well, for all those listeners out there, um, I hope that you find a way to love yourself through your own experiences and journeys. And keep in mind that you are only human. Be kind, be you, and remember that everything is just a part of the journey.